So, good morning and welcome to Crumbs Under the Table, short talks with the dogs. If you're seeing I'm still chewing on something, it's because I've just been picking blackberries. I'm going past that place where there are loads of them, so I think I'm going to have to come back later today with a big bag. Spend hours kind of standing around picking, so I've got about £1 worth of blackberries, but the fact that they're free sounds so great. Anyway, so I've thinking about this morning. I found myself over the last few days, I've been kind of mulling around something which leads to a slightly I'm just trying to think what the right word is without sounding kind of poncy or pompous, but to a slightly kind of more academic thing this morning. Probably academic's the wrong word. It's a little bit. I need to kind of be a bit more careful how I say things or kind of spill them out. Let's just turn the camera around. But I wanted to think about from a spiritual point of view the implications of the what's sometimes referred to as the Matthew principle, which or alternatively, because I'll explain why, from a kind of more rigorous statistical point of view, is referred to as the Pareto Distribution. Because I think it's something we underestimate from a spiritual point of view, and yet, interestingly, it's really a key thing in Jesus' teaching. I mean, it's called sometimes referred to as the Matthew principle, and I'll kind of try and tease out the difference between the distribution and the principle in a second, but the Pareto distribution was kind of observed by I think it was an Italian economist or mathematician, statistician, to do with the distribution of wealth. And he noticed how, if you like, small benefits or small advantages in your ability to have collected and collect wealth actually multiply over time. And so you kind of get a stretching towards the top. When I say, what I mean by stretching is that the gaps between the top 1% and the next 1%, that grows as fast and normally faster than the gap between the second 1% and then the third 1%. And that goes all the way kind of down to the bottom. In other words, things kind of stretch, but at the bottom they stay pretty static, of course. But things are always moving apart from themselves, and so you get a distribution where which tends towards a smaller and smaller percentage of the population actually benefiting from the rewards of more and more of the wealth. So that's the way he saw it in economics. But actually, as then people took his distribution and started to apply it elsewhere, they found it kind of covered huge amounts of things where there was any sort of feedback, if you like, of desire and reward involved. And then I think it was about the 60s or something that a sociologist then kind of associated, and so in kind of general conversational things, we often refer to the 80-20 rule or whatever, and we apply that as a kind of a rule of thumb to so many things. From that 20% of the population will get let's say 20% of professional tennis stars will get 80% of the attention, that kind of thing, and the figure is a kind of a thumb in the air type one, but the general principle is the same idea, that you get this kind of tending towards a smaller group getting most of the accolade or most of the reward. And as I say, what was happening is that then a sociologist looking at it saying, actually, this principle works all over the place. It happens in citations for scientific papers. It happens in sales of books. That, if you like, success breeds success. The rich get rich, the poor get poorer. And you see, the way Jesus puts it, and when I juxtapose that, the rich get rich and the poor get poorer, it doesn't sound like something you'd want to kind of pursue. But Jesus puts it in a way which is challenging, because he says, to him who has, more is given, and to him who hasn't, even what he's got gets taken away. And he says it 4 times. So Matthew, Mark and Luke, so we call it the Matthew principle, I think simply because it appears twice in Matthew, once in the other 2 Gospels. So to have it recorded for us 4 times does mean we need to take it kind of seriously, but very often we over-spiritualise it because we don't want it to mean something negative. So it's just I'm in the shade here, so it's very kind of selfish. I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to stop just here for a minute Maybe I'll walk onto the next tree where there's also a bit of shade. Let's turn the camera around. Yeah, so what was I just saying? Yeah, so the way we kind of over spiritualize it, it's kind of we give it in a positive way, but I think, as I say, we over spiritualize. We say, so to the new Christian, don't worry, what you've got will keep growing, because what you've got, God's going to add to. And before you didn't have, and it was things were getting worse, and so we kind of turn it into a spiritual principle to encourage the idea that those who are new and fresh in their faith will be kind of growing and so on. And it's not wrong, but I think there's more genius in Jesus than just a kind of simple encouragement. I think that sociologists who identified the Pareto distribution with Jesus' Matthew principle were correct to do so, because it actually, as it turns out, it's an incredibly profound observation in life. It applies in so many different circumstances. It's kind of almost embarrassing. And when you realise it, you recognise that, okay, you can hear it in a very negative way when we hear, well, the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. Well, actually, the funny thing is the second half of that's not necessarily true. The rich get rich, the poor don't really get poorer. They tend to feel poorer because the rich have got so much richer. So it's not as quite as bad as perhaps it sometimes sounds. And don't worry, I'm not therefore advocating that doesn't matter, because what I want to kind of get at is at the heart of how we work with something that is generally true in life. and that's the real key. Because I had an opportunity some years back of getting a time in a smaller kind of consultation with a guy who's the chief economist for Mars, a guy called Bruno Roche, which was a fascinating time. Made me think about things I'd never seen before as a Christian. He was. And he talks about actually this. He was talking. He didn't use the terms the Matthew principle or the Pareto effect, but he was talking about how we're accelerating towards the concentration to smaller and smaller groups of more and more of the wealth. And he said that just happens all the time. You look at it in every situation, every system, every economic system. That tends to happen over a period of time. And he said, but then what happens is, of course, and this is kind of I don't just want to talk about money, because I want to talk about value, which is the key here. So I need to get past the money bit. Eventually it becomes kind of so unsustainable, because the gaps, if you like, between the different percentage layers have got so big it's impossible for one person to jump from one to another. And so then you get two things going on. One, there's a kind of resentment up. We see an awful lot of that resentment up. And then the second is, which is the more positive, is that actually in the kind of lower elements, people start to reassess their value system. So if we're all pursuing pound notes, or, well, they're no longer pound notes, pound coins, if we're all pursuing cash, then obviously we're going to see that distribution start to emerge. And so as the gaps get bigger, people start saying, well, I need some cash, and relatively within my percentage I need to feel this against that, and so I need this amount, but actually I'm going to start drawing some of my sense of value and some of what I want to put my skills into from something different. And so I'm intending to go and try and track it down, because I just heard it reported that the BBC's got a series that they've called Brassic, which starts with a comment from someone, Brassic meaning totally skint, no money. It starts with a statement which I want to kind of try and track down, which is people make a mistake if we think we don't have a good culture and don't whatever, because actually this is true, that in people growing up in all sorts of different societies, you can look at them from a pure cash point of view and say, oh, it must be a terrible life. You get there, you find that actually they've drawn their sense of values from something totally different. Of course, at the bigger macro level, you also get situations where like for instance, you've got going on within the euro at the moment, where is it the Italians who are looking at issuing bonds in a way that actually makes them like large-scale cash bonds, which of course is getting stern rebukes from the European Central Bank, because effectively they're issuing a second currency alongside the euro. But that is a way of sort of saying, we're doing so badly out of this system, so we're going to start to find our new value system. And in that smaller way, smaller kind of communities within the context is, well, we need to earn enough from that system to get this, but we're going to develop a parallel system. And so that's a very kind of, if you like, natural phenomena from as the gaps, I think, get bigger and bigger. So more and more people start saying, this isn't a system I'm ever going to get to the top in. I have to play it to some degree, but actually I start turning my sense of where my value comes from and what I draw from to other sources. And I think that this is now, Jesus is saying, it's not just kind of, don't worry, you're a weak Christian at the moment, but you'll get stronger. It is kind of, actually, we need to start to be wise, to recognise that actually, uniquely, all of us have something that we can be good at, i.e. we can be good at being us. But of course, we often abdicate that towards a system because of the need, and also because everybody does, of the kind of how much do we earn, how much do I get, and so on and so forth, and do I feel impoverished or am I impoverished, all of those kinds of questions. And so there's an inevitability in which we have to play to the game over on the side. But actually, if we take the principle properly, there are things that we can do which are about pursuing the truth of who we are and drawing the value from those things. And the funny thing is, because I did have a conclusion to where I want to go, I suspect that actually, what tends to, sorry, going back to this guy, Bruno Roche, what he's saying is you get that thing, inevitably what happens at some point is you get either, sorry, I'm just trying to, I had three, didn't I, but, I can't remember what they were, but you kind of, I can think of two, you kind of, rest, that's right, yeah. He used the phrase that when the gaps get so big, you always get what he calls rest or reset. So rest is a process by which you slow down the stretch. And he points out that biblically you have rest for people, you have rest for resources, so there's a Sabbath year, and you have rest from capital transactions, or you have a reset of capital transactions in the Jubilee. And so he talks about actually how rest and recess can kind of moderate and slow down the stretch. And that's all good. You know, that's part of what government is for, is to try and make the things not too extreme and so on. But we still recognise they will inevitably happen. Unless you try and suppress them so much, you end up suppressing people. And then all that happens is you get a kind of Pareto effect within the place of power, which is now a handful of people own all the power. Instead of a handful of people owning all the money, it just kind of flips over. So you can use things of rest, but that's a contract by agreement that we all agree. So all the shops agree to shut on Wednesday afternoon, and when they all agree to do that, the guy who decides, do you know what, I'm going to open on Wednesday, he gets an advantage, you see. But then when everybody opens on Wednesday afternoon, he hasn't got, I'm thinking about my childhood, it's the way it used to be, he hasn't got an advantage anymore. But he's now having to be open Wednesday afternoon, whereas he could have had a day off. So unfortunately, maintaining that agreement to rest together is actually is not an easy thing to do. And so in the modern world, it's been abandoned. As we lose our Christian roots, we've lost the place of rest, and it all becomes about commerce, and the value of the time now gets stretched. Because we only need a certain amount of food. It doesn't matter how many days of the week we have to buy it on, as long as we can get it when we need it. Kind of, you get what I'm driving at. So similar with with Sunday trading. When everyone's shut on Sunday, it doesn't hurt anybody, because the families still have to buy the same amount of food, but they're buying it in 6 days. But when some shops start opening on Sunday, they have an unfair advantage. So now everybody opens on Sunday. That's a slightly different story to where I was going. We were kind of coming back, so we have to kind of play in certain things, but fundamentally it's, that's right, yes, I was going to say is so you get rest or reset, but then he didn't add the third R, which I've added since, because he was saying what they stop is eventually, otherwise you get revolution. You could perhaps put it as you either reform or you revolt. You get revolution, by which he really means is that the value system collapses. And he made this really interesting point that capital is capital because it exists in the head. It's just another form of agreement. If I have a banknote, it's just a piece of paper, except that everybody in my nation agrees that it's worth something. If I get a banknote from another country, it might be worth an awful lot, but I often don't feel the same emotional attachment to it because I haven't invested internally in its value. so it's kind of widely recognised in the kind of the system where we're competing for money, that money has been attached and given certain values which are actually a mental assent or an agreement between the kind of community. And so there would have been times where thereby land is where we all agree that value is. And in the modern world, it's all what we think of as intellectual property rights. And that's an interesting thing, because, you know, we all agree that intellectual property rights, and so that's how companies value themselves at $1 trillion. It's because of all the patents they own. Of course, but that only works in a society where people adhere to those patents, and which is why loads of people found it really difficult. And we're trying to, you know, the West tries to force the Chinese to recognise patents, because the Chinese can normally produce things much, much cheaper because they just ignore them most of the time. But they kind of show you that kind of fragility, because actually, if you like, that capital value rests in the mental agreement. And what Bruno Roche was saying is, if you don't find that place of reformation, if it's not managed kind of well by rest and reset, eventually there's a revolt and it all kind of collapses. And I think that's increasingly, we're seeing the shakiness of that around the world, is that, if you like, secular value systems are beginning to kind of get so well distributed on the Pareto distribution that there's no longer an ability to kind of move up and down. Social mobility declines as the distribution gets further and further and stretched more and more. But in that context, for those who have already reset themselves to a different value system, you start to work to your value system, which is an expression of who God has made you. Those people benefit, being a little bit kind of cynical about these things, they benefit when systems around them collapse. Because there's something about the way that value speaks into an individual that works across all of the different systems. And so in actual fact, you'll find social mobility happens when, if you like, the prevailing order falls to a degree, because as it falls, those at the top fall further than those further down. And you kind of hit a point where people are kind of falling very close to the layer below them. And those in the layer below them who have got that most sense of their own value and so on, often find that they rise as things start to take off again. And so there is a kind of an uplift, kind of very long term kind of uplift of those who, if you like, have the benefit of value from their own system, when the kind of systems which we are kind of by mutual agreement start to fall around us. So I know, as I said, it's kind of one that you have to follow a little bit this morning, because I have to. That's why I've had to stop walking, kind of follow the argument. And in its kind of own funny way, you know, you notice it because I've met folks over the years, and I'm beginning to understand it myself now. Which is, if I kind of talk from personal testimony, I wrote in one of my books about a word about, in the early days, about being kind of a jack of all trades and master of none. And then at a point where the Lord turned things around a bit, when I've discovered that quote is actually a misquote. It used to be jack of all trades, master of one, which is, back in the old days, if you were a plumber, you probably also needed to know a bit of carpentry, joinery and so on, but you needed to have one trade that you were really good at, and then you had this kind of mix. And I kind of talked in the book about how the Lord turned the thing around. And actually for me, the kind of the master of one was actually probably, as I look back on it and I realise it, having been a kind of a generalist in a general situation, and actually finding myself doing reasonably well in the Christian world as a generalist. I've had incredible opportunities. But actually the Lord's saying, no, start to really focus on who I've made you, which often was around, it seems to be, particularly, well, it's around a certain style of teaching. I won't say I'm the world's best Bible teacher, but it's a certain kind of thread to it, which I kind of then, as you know, I juggled with, and I used the word supernatural from the two books I'd produced under that title. But I kind of really felt led by the Lord to kind of fix then on the Jesus-centered, which is why you'll notice that, you know, that's why I use that one all the time now. But when I started, life was really tough. So I had no income at that point, and you're trying to do stuff, and you're getting kind of small gifts. And I remember telling the Lord when I felt, you know, I think I've said this before on this. I felt like the Lord said, I was saying to the Lord, what shall I do now? And I felt like the Lord said, well, start teaching right through the Bible as to how Jesus appears everywhere. And I responded by saying, well, that won't work because nobody listens to detailed Bible teaching. So it shows my question wasn't what should I do now, it was how am I going to survive. And if you like, in the old system, the old value system, I knew that if I, just being really blunt, if I said I'm going to come and do a prophetic meeting, more people would come and I'd get a better gift. But the Lord was actually saying to do teaching, and teaching on the Gospels, which everyone thinks they know, and teaching on how Jesus appears in the Old Testament. Everyone thinks they know that. So what on earth am I doing it for? And loads of people do it better than, I'm sure they do better than me. But anyway, anyway, started doing those things. It was tough for quite a few years, but I suddenly find myself in a situation now, and I'm still teaching and still finding it tends to be small groups, but somehow something I obviously have, if you like, have achieved something of a status within that. The little bit I did have is kind of reaping certain of the rewards, and so suddenly it doesn't feel to me in many ways like it's much different from when I started, except now the one big difference is somehow I'm able to live on it. And able to take the time in the mornings as I walk my dogs, and then to have thinking time, to prepare thoughts, to prepare content in different ways, whether it's on videos, whether it's in books, whether it's in manuals, whether it's teaching it live. It feels to me now, if you like, that by investing in the value of me being me, I have something that actually is a bit more impervious to the things around me going up and down. But that doesn't come overnight. It takes, if you like, a committed investment to follow what the Lord gives you. And the reason I mentioned, as I say, that's personal testimony. I look back and I think of how many folks I've talked to who I remember use that kind of a phrase along the lines, it took me 20 years to become an overnight success, which is you do what you do, and it seems that actually it's only made you a little bit better than the person next to you at this subject. But actually, as things kind of readjust, as certain value systems, because we live in a complex world with thousands of value systems, money is just the big one, you know. As those things start to shift around us, because the Lord's shaking certain things, and everything that's shaken that isn't kind of eternal starts to fall back, the benefit from those small amount of benefit that you've got from pursuing what the Lord's given you suddenly mean that as people look around and see that you're someone who still has some value, if I can put it that way, actually just your kind of credibility generally goes up. And so it's not a reason to do that thing, it's just a kind of an unexpected benefit that actually, as we genuinely pursue the thing that God gives us to give us value, well, not to give us value because He's already spoken value in us, but as we pursue the thing which expresses the value He's given us, let's put it that way, that's perhaps the better way of putting it, the way He's invested into us, as we pursue those things, while I can't say there's any guarantee to it, it does seem, not just from my own personal experience, but from talking to others, that there's something of that in its own right lifts you. And the world around you will go up and down on different scales. But because it's your scale, you know, you don't have to be competing with others, but actually what you've got, you're finding is added to. And as it is added to, you find there's something in your whole demeanour that is lifted. And as things around you are falling and collapsing, and sometimes re-rising, you find it's easier to start to kind of reach into all of those things, if I can put it that way. Anyway, that sounds like a bit of a brag this morning, which isn't supposed to be. I often start when I talk by saying, you know, if we all did what we knew was good for us, we'd all be healthy, wealthy and skinny. And then I caveat that by saying, so why on earth are you listening to me? Sorry, I think that's really funny. You know, I think how many times have I been in hospital with serious issues? And definitely not got the skinny bit. But still people come and listen. Why do they come and listen? Well, I have a confidence in what I've got to say, which isn't just an automatic thing that got turned on. It's come by the investment into it over time. It comes in the investment of pursuing what God's given me of value, which is an ability to understand, I think, some scripture and a brain that somehow sees connections, and I draw those out for other people and so on. And you know, it's not the same as inventing the iPhone. But for me, it's where my value is. Not that I find it there, but actually it's how I express it, how I express that thing. So I suppose, and all of that rather kind of long-winded way, touching on things that I'm probably not qualified to talk about in economics and statistics and so on. Just wanted to kind of get across this idea that there is potential for real value. If you're insecurely thinking to yourself, well, I'd love to do this, but I don't think I can because I've got to do this. Well, doing this over here is a game that's already being won by somebody else. The thing that's really important is for you to find a way of expressing the value that Jesus has given you, that the Lord has given you. We all have mammon, and I think the best understanding of the word mammon is the ability to kind of draw resources. It's not riches in its own right, and neither is it, if you like, a spirit of money, because if it was a demonic spirit, Jesus wouldn't say be faithful with it. But he says you can't, if you serve that rather than God, it doesn't work. So we're serving God, but we need to express it. So if he's given you an ability with music, and actually and the thing is with an ability in music is that the thing that actually is where you're going to express your value? Not just can you play the piano, but actually is that the thing? So maybe that's a bad example because quite a lot of people have an ability in music, but it's often a combination of how you draw the things together and say, I'm going to live a life that invests in what I know the Lord has gifted me with as a kind of a unique combination of things. And as we kind of pursue that, it can seem tough at the time, and we have to do all sorts of other jobs around the side to give space to do the things we know the Lord's really given us. But in time, we find actually that somehow it becomes an attractor for the value we need to live on. And actually, as other things are going up and down, we find the stability in the truth of the things that God has given us. So I hope that sort of makes sense this morning. I think when I look at the world, certainly the Western world, is not in for an easy future. It's going to be very turbulent. Things are going up and down all over the place. And so I'm kind of a big believer, therefore, in starting to invest in now, in the things that the Lord's really given us, because actually then, as we find we don't have as access quite so easily to the things we thought gave us value because they had to pay for them in different ways, actually when we invest into the things that have value in their own right for us, and we become the best version of us, and we do the best at being us, and all of those sorts of things, and actually the things that we've got, we have more given to us because we put more time into it. Actually, we will find a much more mentally balanced and spiritually balanced society emerging around us, and regardless of the economic situation. So hopefully that doesn't sound too miserable. It sounds like some sort of kind of a revolutionary manifesto. It is kind of countercultural, I think. Genuinely is kind of countercultural, but not in a way that is kind of sticking two fingers up at the culture and saying we're going to bring you down. It's just saying, do you know what? I'm finding my values in different ways. So, Father, I just finish by praying and saying, for those that it's useful to hear, that maybe they've listened right through to the end, that you, by your Spirit, want to speak to today, to make them, help us, encourage us to take the steps we need to take, to step into being who we made to be, to have value in who we are, and to pursue the value systems that you've given us uniquely, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So I will just give you those final shots with the dogs. There's Banjo. And where's Luna gone? She looks like she's found something to eat over there. Yeah, you can see the kind of look on her face for kind of nuzzling stuff out. I think I've said before, she's not beyond eating earthworms if she digs them up. And there we go. So hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. And then, I was about to diverge some kind of family information, but I get into trouble for doing that on live public broadcast. So, so I'll see you tomorrow. Until then, have a really good one. Bye.